Hi everyone, welcome to our Halloween podcast. We are going to be reading lots of spooky, so stay tuned.
Yep, the podcast is now back. It's been a few months, but we thought that Halloween was the best time to kickstart it all again. So we've got some stories from some fantastic authors today. We've got a story from Paul Bahu, from Chris Newton, my brother, who was on the first episode of the podcast, from Christopher Cisneros, who's going to be giving us quite a long interview about his new project that he's working on. And we've also got a short poem from Ismail Rodriguez. Let's jump into the first of our series of interviews. Let's start with the first story, which is an interview with Christopher Cisneros. He's going to be reading a couple of stories from a planned saga called Paradise Cemetery. Christopher, when you're ready, just want to kick us off?
Yes, sir. Here we go. Paradise Cemetery. Halloween night, I was 13 years old, trying to be brave and bold. I entered Paradise Cemetery on a dare to show the bullies I was no easy scare. Flashlight in hand, I prodded among the dead and suddenly felt a presence which filled me with dread. When I turned around, my light flashed on a face so pretty, not rotted, gross, or gritty. She wore a white dress and in her hair a blue bow. Is it Halloween? The girl wanted to know. I nodded, my legs urging me to run. She shouted out, I can play until the rising sun. Please play with me, she pleaded, for it was a playmate she needed. Hide and seek was her favorite game, so she shared. I said nothing, just stood there scared. She turned away and started to count. I looked around for a way out. I ran to the wall and was about to climb when I heard her sob and say she was almost out of time. I went back to her and flashed my light. She smiled at the beam so bright. I asked her if she wanted to go to a Halloween dance with me. Yes, she cheered and jumped up with glee. We ran past the mortuary and went over the wall of Paradise Cemetery, skipped the long old Connor Street, but stopped halfway when she screamed, I don't have a costume to wear. So I stole a bed sheet from a clothesline. I didn't care. We cut holes for eyes, and now she was a ghost. I was Davy Crockett, and we held hands under the glow of a lamp post. The girl was so happy and began to spin around. She said, it feels so good to be out of the ground. What do you mean by that? I asked her, but she went silent. Enough had been said, as it were. The road was dark, cold, and scary, and she whispered to me that her name was Carrie. I told her my name was Harold, Harold Fitzgerald. We made it to the party, just a bit tardy. The kids were dancing to the song Shaboom, all dressed up in neat costumes. I told Carrie that I didn't know how to dance, and with a smile she replied, just give it a chance. She placed my hands on her shoulders and led, on my chest is where she rested her head. We danced all night long to some really boss songs. Just one more, she whispered. It felt like a dream being with this girl. She removed her ghost sheet and smiled so sweet. My special angel played next. As we waltzed, on my lips she gave me a peck. The song ended and she ran away. I chased after her, wanting her to stay. I called out her name not once but twice as I ran all the way to paradise. I struggled up a grassy hill and saw a crow perched upon a church steeple. His shrieks echoed across the night and chilled me to the bone with fright. I found Carrie at the cemetery gates looking up at the moon. She said that an evil man had ended her life much too soon. It happened Halloween night on the way to a dance. She was found on the side of the road in the grass. We went back over the wall, and she showed me something I hadn't really wanted to see. I flashed my light on a tombstone and found that it was her own. Carrie Ortega, 1922 to 1935. It was 22 years ago that she stopped being alive. Carrie started to cry. I held her and felt the tears well in my eyes. I stayed with her until my flashlight flickered and went black. The time had come for her to go back. The sun rose over the treetops and peeked through the branches. Would there be any more chances? She promised me she would return when I needed her. Just flash the light and she'd be there. My special angel right from paradise. I know you're an angel. Heaven is in your eyes. She faded away to nothing, and I was left alone sobbing. The night retreated against the daylight. As it did, I got a glimpse of a monster as it tried to hide. It fled with the shadows, withering in pain as it did so. Into a crypt the monster went, and till this day I can't get that image out of my head. That was 65 years ago, and now I'm 78 years old, in a nursing home ready to depart this life. I have no more fight. So I snuck out into the parking lot on Halloween night, flashed that light so bright, and Carrie returned as promised. We were together again under a moon called harvest. When I was found, I was cold to the touch and laying on the ground. My life was jubilee, so don't feel sorry for me. I was taken to Paradise Cemetery to cry unnecessary. Carrie and I can now dance and play every Halloween night until the light of day. So that was the first one. So I'll go ahead and I'll start the second one. This is an expansion of that story. This one is called Edgar. The house was an old Victorian, and it is where my story begins. Daddy got a new job, you see, as the caretaker of Paradise Cemetery. My name is Sloan, and I live above a funeral home. I've no sisters or brothers, just me, my mother, and father. I'm the daughter of a mortician, and that creepy girl no one wants as a friend. It's my home where folks come to say goodbye to the ones they loved who have died. An hour into our new life, and Daddy's answering a first call. The Reaper respects no time at all. He comes at all hours of the night and day, weekends, special events, and holidays. Sometimes he'll show a little mercy and let folks have their goodbyes and apologies. Other times he's in a bad mood and will take a multitude of souls in an act of moral turpitude. Death must have seen us coming and was out heart-stopping. I asked Daddy if I could come along with him on this call to the house of a man named Paul. He said yes, but as usual, I would have to wait in the hearse. Once we got to the house of Mr. Wirtz, the rain had started to fall as we headed for our destination, and some thunder boomed across all creation. This sleepy little town called Paradise is a place where there's much more than meets the eye. As we drove through the streets of town, people stared at us, crossed themselves, and frowned. The Wirtz family waited outside in the rain, and despite the angry sky above, there they remained. They wore clothes that looked from another age, and stood all perfectly still, staring ahead, very strange. Daddy parked the hearse and went around to get the stretcher. The Wirtz family pointed to the house altogether. The rain continued to come down in sheets and covered up all the streets. 15 minutes later, Daddy reemerged with the body of Mr. Wirtz, and together we got him in the hearse. He spoke with a tall man who only nodded his replies and showed no emotion for the man who had died. Daddy got in the car and we headed back to the cemetery. I turned back one last time and saw a girl my own age staring at me. Her blue dress barely hung to her scraggly body, and her blonde hair was matted down and covered most of her face, but I could still see her frown. A shiver ran up my spine and goose pimples cascaded my arms, but all I wanted to do was to get home and out of the storm. As we passed under the gates of the cemetery, there came another boom, and lightning flashed across the tombs. Mother opened the garage doors, and Daddy backed the hearse in. We struggled to close the doors back up again. Mr. Wirtz went into the cooler, and Daddy said he'd work on him later. I hurried upstairs to watch the storm rage, but as I opened my door, I was welcomed by something strange. My boxes were scattered about, and my things flew all over the place. The wind swirled around the room, and cold rain pelted my face. My shutters had been flung open, and the latch broken. I was wet and cold, but needed to get the window closed. Using the pant leg of one of my jeans, I secured the shutters. The winds died away, but that's when I heard a flit and a flutter. I turned around slowly, and to my surprise, I was surprised by what my eyes had me see. It was a black crow which burst through the window. He was as dark as the bleak December, and was wet from beak to tail feather. He perched upon my bedpost and flapped his wings, and all I could do was think of dreadful things, like devils, ghosts, and goblins, nightmares, curses, and omens. His little dark eyes followed my every move. My legs urged me to run, but I had to play it cool. I didn't know what this beastie might do. Was he friend or foe? I had no clue. The storm pounded my window with all of its might. That's when the crow let out a little cry. I could see that one of his wings was hurt, and thought, poor little bird. I gulped and moved along the wall. and he let out a painful call. I stopped in my tracks and pointed to the bathroom, and he shook all of his plumes. I brought out a towel and draped it around the fowl. The bird began to caw awful loud. I told him to calm down before my parents found out. He winced as I patted him dry, and by whom I was still mystified. I heard my parents coming up the stairs and down the hall, and I took the bird and stuffed him under the bed next to some dolls. My folks burst into my room and asked me about the ruckus. I told them that the wind blew in, turning my room into a cycle circus. They told me to pick up as much as I could and get ready for bed. I smiled wide and nodded my head. Once they left, I tended to my uninvited guest. I made him a nest of old socks, shoes, and socks, and cleaned up the room while he nodded off. The night passed quickly, and the rays of the sun awakened me. I stretched and yawned wide, and upon my bed the crow did climb. He perched upon my chest, so I reached out and petted him as a test. He let me run my fingers through his feathers. I guess he felt a bit better. There was a slight rapping at my door. Yes, I answered, this and nothing more. Honey, can you help me clean up downstairs? Mother asked. I'll be down in a few, I answered fast. Thank you, she replied and left. When I sat up, the crow hopped back into his nest. I told him that breakfast would be nothing fancy and put in his nest some candy. I opened the shutters to a foggy autumn morning and spotted a figure out there walking. Strolling among the tombstones was an old man with a shovel in his right hand. He planted the shovel into the ground, took a drink from a flask, and looked around. He spotted me up in the room looking down at him and stared at me, his face so grim. I retreated in and closed the shutters, and again there came the voice of my mother. Sloan, I hope you're getting ready up there. I am, I answered her. I told Daddy about the man in the graveyard, and he said his name was Bernard, and that he dug the graves, mowed the grass, worked on the cars at the cemetery for as long as the night had stars. I ate only Pop-Tarts for breakfast and got to work cleaning up the new office. Mother vacuumed the chapel and polished the pews while I dusted the casket room. It took a lot of elbow grease to get everything real clean. There was dirt and grime all over and in between. When we were done, the funeral home looked good, and it put us all in a nice mood. Daddy got a shipment of new caskets and urns, and while he looked them over, I went to check on my bird. He was on the balcony rail, cawing and moving his tail. However, he couldn't fly away. His broken wing meant he'd have to stay. The doorbell rang. I went out to the balcony and peeked down at the Wirtz clan. Edgar, oh, that's what I named the crow, appeared unnerved by the family below. He leapt off the rail and hopped back to his spot, and there he sat. The sun was bright, and its light filtered in the funeral home, but uncannily, darkness seemed to follow the Wirtz family. I couldn't see their faces, although I did try. The house just seemed darker. They sat quietly like wax figures in the parlor. I stretched my neck like I hung from the gallows, trying to see through the shadows. Mother placed her hand on my shoulder, startling me so I wanted to choke her. Sloan, what are you doing? I answered her with the truth. I'm spying. Well, stop it, Mother scolded. Why don't you go out and do something more productive? It wasn't a bad idea that Mother had. I should check out the graveyard firsthand. So I put on my Bauhaus t-shirt, cut up jeans, Doc Martens, and went out to scope the scene. Paradise Cemetery was a huge memorial park, and to get around it would be quite the walk. Still, I was game for a new adventure. I just wish I could have taken Edgar. The cemetery was like the moon of Endor, with huge trees everywhere. A lot of the markers dated well over 100 years ago, back to Pilgrim days, I guess, I don't know. I strolled around for hours and picked a lot of wild flowers. I had a conversation with Bernard, who sat under a tree with his old dog. He told me that all around used to be nothing but farms as far as the eye could see. Now it's just a cemetery. I've dug graves for most of those people, he said to me. What happens after death pays a visit? That's a mystery. Bernard returned to his work. His dog was slow to rise, and before he left, let out a lazy bark. I continued my grim adventure, getting in touch with the spirits and Mother Nature. I sat on a bench facing the area set aside for babies, which made me sad to see. All the markers were tiny and decorated with angels and teddies. I decided it was time to make my way back home when I heard a noise letting me know that I was not alone. I called out Bernard's name, but that was in vain. I snapped around to the trees, just in time to see a four-legged creature charging at me. I let out a powerful scream, for I believed this was the end, and I was not yet even 16.
Fantastic.
So there you go. That was Paradise Cemetery and Paradise Cemetery Saga, Chapter 1, Edgar.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing both of those stories.
No problem. Yes, sir. Thank you for allowing me, giving me the platform to do that.
It was great to get that sort of insight into what I assume is the early days of the project.
Oh, yes, it is. It is very much so. Originally, I wrote Paradise Cemetery as a standalone poem back Halloween of last year, and I went around and I read it at poetry readings, open mics, things of that nature. Halloween open mics, we had one not too long ago, things like that. And so the reaction I was getting was very, very positive. This whole kind of Tim Burton-esque kind of feel to that little story. And the suggestions started to come in about, like you had mentioned in one of the questions that you had written to me, Michael, about certain characters in that story. And I'll let you ask those questions in a bit. And so that gave me the idea to try to expand on this story and possibly create an entire little universe around it.
I think that's sometimes the best way when you start something intending to write something small and then it ends up expanding into something much, much larger. It's always interesting when that happens. So let's start with the very basics. What inspired you to write Paradise Cemetery?
I had written a series of poems and short stories in the year before. Yours was one of those, Blood Red, the Norrish werewolf story that I sent in to you guys was one of those stories. I had written a ghost story as well called The Mystery of Emma Villanueva, which was sent to a literary magazine for a university. And so also there was some poems that I had written that were garnishing a lot of attention. Some of them got published. Another one was another university literary magazine, and then one was a local Texas publisher who published these poems. So I had been, diddly daddling with a bunch of different kinds of stories. A lot of them were always serious, and I wanted to challenge myself to see if I could do a more Goosebumps, Tim Burton kind of, as opposed to the stuff that I had been writing, and that's what Paradise Cemetery came out to be. Originally, it was going to be a short story, but when I started thinking about it, I was thinking of The Nightmare Before Christmas or The Corpse Bride, and how those stories were basically told with a lot of songs in them, and the songs, like, rhyming songs. So I said, why not try it in that kind of thing? And with the end result was the poem that I just read.
Was there a particular moment that made you realize that this was no longer a short story, but was going to be something larger?
Well, the moment came with the intention that it was beginning to generate, because people just wanted to know more about it. There's local legends, like I'm sure there's some there in England too, about the phantom hitchhikers or the girl, and that you go to the dance with and she suddenly ends up being a ghost. This story was not unique in that way, but the origin stories are often more interesting than the original story, and so people wanted to know, what happens with this? What's the end result? When Mr. Fitzgerald died, he was in his almost 80 years old. So what happened in all the intervening years after he met Carrie? Did he ever see her again before his death? So there was a lot of questions that people were asking me, and that's why I said, well, maybe I could expand it into something entirely different, and see where it goes from there.
Absolutely. So the name Paradise Cemetery is very interesting. What inspired its origin?
Well, like, I don't know if you might remember this, Michael, but at our last conversation, I told you that I do work in a mortuary. The mortuary that I work for is Corpus Christi, here in Corpus Christi, called Seaside Cemetery. But a lot of the sections in our cemetery have these sort of like biblical names and stuff like that, and as many of the cemeteries that I've visited, whether with the job or just out of curiosity, I'm into that kind of stuff. They always have names like Resurrection or Heaven's Gate and stuff like that. So I wanted it to have a similar feeling, that it would be a cemetery that you might actually encounter out there somewhere in another city or another state, or where there might actually be a Paradise Cemetery. So Paradise being a reference to heaven, I said, well, Paradise Cemetery, that sounds very, very realistic. So that's why the name came. However, in the story that I'm expanding here, like, I decided to name the town Paradise, the town of Paradise. So the cemetery is actually named for the town in the new story that I'm currently writing.
That's really interesting. So, do you feel that those experiences of working within the mortuary have sort of helped a lot with many of the perspectives of this story?
Oh, absolutely. You know, there are certain terms that we use in the business. For example, when the girl mentions that they were only an hour into their new life and the father got a first call. A first call is when someone has passed and they call up the funeral home, whether it's the hospital, the morgue, or the nursing homes or whatever. They call the funeral home to alert us of a death, of a passing. That's called the first call. So some of those things definitely come into play, where the girl waits in the hearse, while her father's the one that goes and does this, because she's, only 15 years old. So she's not an employee of the funeral home. So it's disrespectful for her to get off and be part of this. So her dad is the one that does it until she helps him put the body into the back of the hearse. So things like that. Of course, the whole aspect of just being part of a funeral, the things that most people don't see until they actually get there, the cleaning up of the place, the setting up of flowers, the lighting of candles, the dressing up of the deceased, and all that stuff. Those things will be featured, as the story progresses, because she lives in a funeral home. Her father is the mortician, the local mortician. So this is her life. She opens up her door, her bedroom window, and the sight that she catches is a cemetery. So
yeah, and it those experiences you mentioned there, they're the sort of things that a lot of writers have to sort of Google or look up or research in some way. So
well, one of the things too, Michael, and I don't mean to interrupt. One of the things too is the perception of death that people have. That as a scary, weird thing. This girl doesn't see it that way, because this is part of her life. Death is actually part of her life. It's the everyday thing. She comes downstairs from her room, and there's the funeral home right there. As she's walking to school, she has to go down that winding path to the cemetery gates. So to her right and to her left are nothing but tombstones. So yeah, there you go. I'm trying to eliminate some of that, but it's only so that we could reintroduce it later in a different way, in a different way. So, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear about how those things came about. The story features a character called Carrie. Did you draw any inspiration from the Stephen King novel of the same name?
No, that was actually coincidental. The name Carrie is because the story Paradise Cemetery, the poem, it takes place in the mid 1950s, late 1950s, right around there. And so I was trying to stick to the aesthetics of the 50s. So names like Peggy Sue or Mary Lou, things like that. So Carrie was one of those things that one of those names that popped into my head, thinking about it. I said, okay, that sounds very 50-ish. So it wasn't Carrie from Stephen King, although I do love that story. I've seen the movie I don't know how many times, and the many different versions of it that are out there. I've read the book, when I was a teenager, so I'm very conscious of that story. As a matter of fact, that story does play into another thing that I'll tell you about after a while. But anyway, no, Carrie is because I wanted it to really be 1950-ish kind of thing, so there you go. That's where the name really comes from. Is from that. It's coincidental that it's Stephen King's story.
And speaking of the character of Carrie, she seems to be too interesting to leave it at that. Will she be featured anymore in the story as you progress with?
Yes. As a matter of fact, Michael, it's her death that will be will basically lead them down the rabbit hole for the next story that the expansion universe. The man that is mentioned very briefly there. That a man had ended her life much too soon. Well, we'll find out later on more about him and what happens with him and everything else. And her death is actually. It turns out to be one of a few that plagued the town back in the late 1940s, and then of course these things occur every other few decades. And now that we are in modern times, Sloan stumbles across this mystery, and that's where Carrie's story. Well, and Harold Fitzgerald, who the old man from the story, actually ends up in her funeral home, at her home. And as they're doing inventory of the man's possessions, she finds a note in his pocket. The note being the original poem that I just read you. So that will lead her into this mystery that she and her newfound friends in that town of paradise will try to unravel.
You sort of touched on this before, but I think that is one of the interesting things about this short story, is that it touches on all these things that make you want to know more. You know, Carrie's death and all the time that passes for the narrator. You know, it will be thrilling to know where all these different sort of routes go. So you've obviously been thinking about these for a while.
One of the things too, like I mentioned in our last conversation about the werewolf story, because that werewolf story had actually been one that was floating in my head for a number of years before I really sat down and typed it out and, you know, submitted it to Rogue Animal. So I collect all these ideas, and sometimes I don't know where they're gonna go. So I write them and I put them away, and then later on I have this catalog of, you know, ideas that I can draw from. So if I'm doing a story, Paradise Cemetery, and I say, oh, well, I want to expand it. Well, how will I do this? Well, I go to this catalog and I start drawing, you know, these different notes and saying, okay, like a puzzle, I start putting these pieces together. Well, this doesn't work, that will work, whatever, you know, and that's how the stories start to form. And then I create a soundtrack, what I want the music for this story to sound like, Danny Elfman, or, you know, things like that, of that nature, you know. And so you know, that's where these things come. So the stories are always there for me. They're just not quite put together. You know, it's like having the ingredients for a cake, but you don't have the cake yet. You know, you just have the ingredients set out on the counter, you know. But you know, eventually if you put them together, they'll make a cake. And that's the way it is for me when I do these things. So, you know, the main complaint that I get from a lot of people is that, well, Christopher, it takes you such a long time to write something. And I say, yes, it does, but because I always want this end product to really be something that I'm going to be proud of, that I want the audiences I'm always thinking about the audience. I want the audience to really, really take something out of it. So when I read Paradise Cemetery and I have people ask me, well, what about this character? Then I know that I did the right thing in waiting for this moment to release that story.
Definitely, absolutely.
Edgar is a much darker tone in story compared to Paradise Cemetery. Was that deliberate?
Yes, it was. As a matter of fact, drawing from not just the experiences that I have working in a mortuary, or, you know, from these notes that I do, as like I said, it takes me a while to write these things, and the reason is because I really, really think these things through, try to plan them out. So if you watch anthology stories from, let's say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, maybe even the 90s, you could throw in there, I don't know, stuff like The Twilight Zone, From Beyond, Amazing Stories, even Eerie, Indiana in the 90s. They were touching on scary themes and, you know, supernatural and all that, but they kind of played it safe. However, by the time you get to modern day, you have more shows like Stranger Things and stuff like that, where they don't have a problem showing deaths and mutilations. I mean, maybe a little bit low key there, but mutilations, and talks about that stuff. You look at the TV show Wednesday, and you know they really do, you know, are a lot darker. Wednesday is a lot darker than, let's say, the Addams Family of the 1960s. A great example of that would be Sabrina, the Teenage Witch from the 90s, compared to the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is today. Because audiences change, the tastes change. So even though Paradise Cemetery isn't a story that was written, you know, 60 years ago, it still very much plays that way, because I wanted it to be that whole 50s kind of feel. But since Edgar is today, right now, I wanted to do the same thing and take that little bit darker tone for the people today, to kind of show, like I was telling Michael, this passage of time, you know, that has gone through, the way Harold Fitzgerald saw the story compared to the way Sloan Alvarez is experiencing the story today.
Before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to quickly pick up on something you said earlier, which was about the playlist you said that you created when
yes.
writing. That's really interesting to me because I feel I have to write with music playing. So how do you approach that?
Okay, so I'm a big music fanatic. I mean, all genres. If it sounds good, I'm listening to it. It could be music from India, from Taiwan, any place around the world, any genre of music. It doesn't have to be. I grew up as a punk rocker, but it isn't. I don't stay there. Obviously. So I choose anything and everything. And when I'm coming up with a character, especially if it's a young character like Sloan Alvarez here, she's only 15. Well, music is part of your identity at that age. And so in order for the people to really identify with the character, they really want to know a lot about them. So one of the things that I do is I try to create a soundtrack for that person. If she was a real friend of mine, if I was hanging out with her and we were in her car, or I was chilling out with her at her house, what would the posters on the wall be? What would the music playing be? Would it be Harry Styles, or would it be, what would it be? So she mentions there a Bauhaus t-shirt. I don't have to write any songs in particular or anything like that. If you know the band Bauhaus, then you know exactly what the girl's talking about. In the Paradise Cemetery, I write the name of the song Shaboom, which is a sock hop song from the 1950s. Also, the song My Special Angel, again, another sock hop song from the 50s. And one of the things that I like to do, guys, is I like to pepper these things into my stories so that the audiences will always have something to draw from. What was he talking about? Shaboom. And then they'll Google it and they'll listen to the song and, oh, that's what it was. I never heard of Bauhaus. What did she mean a Bauhaus t-shirt? They Google it. Oh, that's what he was talking to. And so, that's what the songs have to go. And it's not just that. It's songs that will never appear in the story. It's just like to have it playing like a Danny Elfman kind of theme playing over a chase scene that I may be writing at the time, in my head. And, it's, that the girl is on a scooter being chased around by a maniac in an ice cream truck. So I'm playing I just gave a scene in the story. But anyway, there's a certain song by Oingo Boingo that is playing over that in my head over that scene. So it helps me write the curves and the emotions and all this stuff as how the audiences are supposed to perceive the story.
It's interesting you mentioned people Googling things. Someone commented a while back on one of our posts on Facebook that their editor had said that they shouldn't use words that would challenge the reader that would pull them out of the story. And I was saying at the time that's so, opposite of the way I approach it, that reading is such a good way of educating yourself and learning new things. And the idea of people Googling or researching things is a sort of intrinsic part of that. So it's
absolutely that goes against some of the popular things. Look at Stranger Things. When they featured the song by Kate Bush, right, Running Up the Hill, a lot of the kids in this generation, 20 and under, they didn't know the song. That's a lot of folks. You really had to have been for, because even Kate Bush, she was popular in the 80s, but by the 90s she was gone. By the 2000s, it was party music that just plays in the background. So when they reintroduced the song into the lexicon, a lot of it became a #1 hit, but because people were Googling it, wanting to know more about it, and wow, that's where it came from. So no, I don't agree with that 100%, because when I was a child, I grew up in a small town, and so I didn't know a lot about, like, let's say, classical music. And so when I would hear a song in 2001 Space Odyssey or Clockwork Orange, what is that song? So we didn't have Google back then. So I would be humming it, and eventually I would find out it was Mozart or Beethoven or whatever it was. And so it was great for me. To me, it allowed the story to continue to play as a part of my life, not just simply something that I read or something that I watched somewhere or something that I heard. I wanted the stories to really be part of my life. And as a result, I do that with the things that I write. I want people to continue to be looking into it, even, after they read it. Okay, well, what was he talking about there? What was this? What was that? And, he made a reference to this. And even if it's a very obscure reference, like the Bauhaus t-shirt, hey, whatever, somebody out there will be looking at it and they'll download the music, and Bauhaus will be so happy for me. I mean, I just gave them some money, you know what I mean? So you never know. I mean, I like this interactive part of storytelling. Storytelling was supposed to always be an interactive pastime. It wasn't something that was just meant to be heard and then forgotten. The elders in the tribes, when they would tell their stories to others, it was so that people could take lessons away, so that they could continue to remember the stories, to tell them the stories later on themselves, and the story would stay alive. But if we do what the editor had told your friend to do, then those stories will die right away, because we're not supposed to challenge people. Well, that's what storytelling is. It is supposed to challenge people. Any movie, any song, any poem, any story, it's meant to challenge. It's meant to make a connection.
Absolutely.
That's what I think.
I completely agree with that one. And it is really interesting to hear about the music aspect, and because I know a lot of people are quite divided whether they can write with music or whether they have to be in complete silence. So that, yeah.
Well, Quentin Tarantino, when Tarantino starts to write a screenplay, and I read this one time in a magazine, which surprised me a lot because I thought maybe I had invented this. I was sad to learn that I had it. A lot of people do it. Quentin Tarantino does the same thing. Tarantino says he thinks of a story idea, Django Unchained, and it's supposed to be a Western. So he goes and he has a huge record collection, and he takes all these spaghetti Western themes, and he starts writing scenes for his movies around these spaghetti Western themes, because he's doing a Western, or he's doing Inglourious Bastards or whatever. And the infamous scene in Reservoir Dogs with the ear chopping off thing, Stuck in the Middle by Stealers Wheel, he had the song already in his head, and he decided to write the scene playing to the song. So yeah, I mean, Tarantino's been, I mean, excuse me guys, but tell me if he's not a successful guy. And he does this stuff. So yeah, there you go. Something that I guess people just do. I mean, I thought I had invented it. I was sad to learn that I had it.
Yeah, so there are obviously quite a lot of references to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven in this story. What drew you to that poem?
What drew me to that poem was the creation of the character of Sloane Alvarez. I wanted to give her some kind of a personality without throwing that personality in people's faces. Like, I didn't want her to shout from the rafters, "Look at me, I'm goth," or whatever. I didn't want her to do that. I just wanted her to be living her regular life, but her life happened to be this sort of, alternative type of lifestyle. And so the references to Edgar Allan Poe really come not from me, but from the character. A major change there is that she has a crow and not a raven. However, in her mind, it's a similar thing. So she naturally is drawn to these things like poems by Edgar Allan Poe, maybe horror picture shows, maybe gothic music. And it's just a natural inclination that she has for it because of where she is and how she's growing up. It's kind of like if you grow up in a horse farm, and you naturally listen to country music, and you wear the clothes and the cowboy hats and all that stuff. It's not really anything else other than that. Just becomes an extension of you. That's who and what you are, because this is the environment. So her environment being what it is, this is where she goes. And I do have that mentioned in one of the other chapters that I've written for the Paradise Saga, where she kind of mentions her liking of these women, that she says Elvira, she read Elvira's story in a book, and it led her down this rabbit hole towards Vampira and Betty Page and individuals like that, that she sees as strong, creative, independent women that are out there doing their thing. And so Edgar Allan Poe was just somebody or something that she just naturally likes. So when she comes into a situation that reminds her of a story, Edgar Allan Poe's poems in this case, her automatic writing will be to reference those poems, and she references them not like in your face. It's just sort of like, "He was as dark as the bleak December. That's when I heard a flit and a flutter. I said this and nothing more." So it's just part of her regular talk to be able to use Edgar Allan Poe and things like that, So there you go.
And with someone like Poe, who is so sort of intrinsically a part of that sort of horror
Yes.
identity. Did you feel
Yes.
that the child? I mean, because you have integrated it in quite a natural way, and it doesn't feel like it, it sort of stands out or diminishes the story in any way. But do you think it's you have to be quite careful when you're putting a reference like that into something?
Yeah, you obviously do. You obviously do because you don't want to use it in the wrong way. You don't want to think that you're so much smarter than everybody else and that no one's going to pick up on something. So the way that I do it is very cautionary. I don't want the characters to ever come off as snobbish or Mrs. Know-it-alls. She's only 15, so naturally I have to write in the form of a 15-year-old. And so when I use the Edgar Allan Poe, I never actually mention Edgar Allan Poe. I never actually mention The Raven. I never actually mention any of that. I just simply reference certain things and allow the audience, like you did, to make your own conclusions from that. So she names the crow Edgar, even though in the original poem it's a raven, not a crow. But this is just the way the girl is interpreting the event that's going on around her. So she naturally thinks of, okay, well, what can I name my crow? Oh, Edgar, after Edgar Allan Poe. So anybody who's familiar with Mr. Poe's work would pick up on that right away and say, oh yeah, okay, but isn't the story about a raven, not a crow? Yes, it is, but that goes to what you were saying about how I reference these things very cautionary, because it is the girl's interpretation of the events, because I'm writing it through her eyes. So it's her, she's interpreting what's going on in the story, and that's where it comes from. So after that, everything else is just the bleak December, or a Flint and a Flutter and stuff like that, where it's just not actually telling you, oh, right away, oh, it reminded me of the Raven. I'm not going to mention that. Oh, this is so Edgar Allan Poe. I don't mention any of that stuff. I just kind of just throw it in there because it's something that she naturally would, how she would react to this event.
Yeah, I think you do that quite effectively. Another reference I noticed in there, you talked about a tall man at one point. Was that a Phantasm reference?
As a matter of fact, it was just like very, very similarly to what I did with Blood Red, the werewolf story. Is I mention a lot of werewolf references in that story. Never directly, never in your face. The guy mentions when he's shot and he's laying there next to the dead guy, he says, how did I end up here next to Lon Chaney Jr.? Or he mentions, the mention of Bela Lugosi. There all these little sorts of kind of werewolf references without actually saying the word werewolf. I never don't mention that. And to the very end of the story, that that's what it is. For all we know, it could be a maniac who thinks he's a werewolf. We don't know any of that stuff. And so it's just this kind of way to keep the audience hooked and wanting to hear or read more. And so the same thing here, no different. So what I did is I wanted to touch on a lot of these mortuary kind of movies, the Hearse or Phantasm, the tall man from Phantasm, things of that nature. Absolutely. So that you guys will know, over there in Mario, England, the story actually, I wanted it to have the feel of a Hammer film. I was a big Hammer films fan. Dracula, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Donald Pleasence, all of these gothic stories. And what Hammer Film was good at doing was that they would take these stories that a lot of people already knew. People had seen the Universal Wolfman and the Universal Frankenstein, Universal Dracula. But what Hammer did is they took those stories and they made them more gothic. They made them more English. They brought in, they used up their English actors, and these characters were performed almost Shakespearean. And I loved that. I was a big fan. I still am a very big fan of the old Hammer films. And so the guy in the cemetery in the fog, walking around, grimly looking up at the girl as she's, staring down at him from her upper window. That's a Hammer scene right there. That's a total Hammer scene. And so I use a lot of those kind of to really bring it home where I want the story to go, what I want it to be. It's adding that tone to it, where we kind of switch from Paradise to this, and it's like, okay, well, I get it, I see it, We see that in some stories, and they do it very effectively. Other stories don't really do it that great, for whatever reasons. I think some people get over ambitious, and they just really want to. But not me. I take what I saw when I was a child, what I read, where whatever, and I try to make my world out of these things. But maybe that's not the right thing. I try to make their world, the characters' worlds, out of these things, because I'm the writer. They're the ones that are living this stuff.
Right, so you mentioned that you want to expand the world of Paradise Cemetery into a wider Sega. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I I want to. I'm always looking for different creative ventures. The story that I submitted to you all last year was a short story. The this now a poem, kind of like a little, Allen Ginsberg epic poem thingy. It's a poem. It's written in poem form, a rhyming story. I'm always looking to expand on my creativeness, and so the story is actually a trilogy. But here's the thing: it's not a trilogy in which the characters even know each other or even aware of one another. The only connecting fiber between this trilogy is going to be the antagonists, which are three demonic brothers who have been going about the world causing chaos or whatever. And so that's the only connecting fiber, is these three antagonists. And then of course the stories that revolve around them. Paradise Cemetery will be written as a poem, and it'll tell the story of Sloane and this thing that she encounters in that small town. However, the second entry into this universe, Scary Mary, is told as a screenplay, as a teleplay. It could either be used for episodic TV show or a comic book. That's the form that I've written. I've already written that one. It's the same universe though. We find out that there may be a reference to the events of Scary Mary in Paradise Cemetery or vice versa. And then the third part of it will be told as a short story called I'm a Weirdo. And again, the characters in the three stories, the main characters, they never meet. They will never meet. They don't. It's not like they're related. It's not like this. Whatever. It's not a lineage. It just so happens that these characters in those three different formats come into contact with the three demonic brothers that are the ones out there doing whatever they're doing. And so I thought, it'd be really neat to write one as a poem, write one as a play, write one as a short story, and just allow the audience to jump back and forth from these different formats, different genres, and being able to enjoy the stories and say, hey, wait a minute, there's a reference to that. Hey, I read that. Oh yeah, there's a reference to, and that's it. So that's the universe that I'm trying to create here, where all these different characters exist within the confines of this universe, but they don't actually ever really meet. It's not like Iron Man and the Hulk or anything like that, So I mean, there you go. That's my expansion on this, and doing it in three different formats challenges me creatively to be able to come up with characters and write about these characters, but in different ways. And it also would be interesting for the audience to kind of follow along and say, oh wow, it's like, they did this and that. That's pretty cool. It's like if we were in a story right now and Joe's story was told on Netflix, Mike's story was in the theaters, but Christopher's story was told on an album. It was like a rock opera or something. But it's all the same universe. It's all the same story, the same place, but it's told three different ways. I think that would be really cool, and it's just a creative endeavor that I'm trying to undertake here. Will I be successful? I don't know. I hope I am. We'll see what happens.
The way you were talking about it then actually reminds me, I don't know if you're familiar with Pink Floyd's The Wall, but that was made as an album, yes, a film,
yes,
and a stage show. So that sort of reminds me of that concept.
Album, Pinball Wizard, the Who, right? You could buy the rock opera, but imagine if there was a movie that was in the same universe but didn't involve the same characters from the Pete Townsend album. It just had different characters, but it's the same. There might be a reference to a character there, but it's an entirely different story. It could even be a standalone. And then that one is also the next entry into that is actually a comic book. It's not even a movie or an album. It's a comic book, a graphic novel, and it's the same universe, So I thought that would be, a very creative endeavor for me to undertake and see if I'll be successful with it. I don't know if it's ever been done. It might have been. It might have been done somewhere. I haven't heard of anybody doing something like that. But it's just a challenge. It's a challenge to me creatively, and I'm challenged that I'm willing to try. I hope I'm successful.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of writing in all these different styles as well is interesting to me because it's something that I've always tried to do when I'm approaching a project. I typically don't like to stay within, third person or first person or whatever. I like to bring in second person and diary entries and sort of swap it around. So do you feel it's important?
And even different genres, because the Scary Mary story that I wrote, the screenplay, and I'm doing the editing on it, the finishing touches. I had an idea of expanding that as well in its own little thing, Scary Mary, and it would be something called Neon Maniacs, which would be Scary Mary would be more like a Lost Boys, Stranger Things kind of thing, whereas Neon Maniacs would be more of a cyberpunk story, but it would be the same characters would interact in that one way or the other, as opposed to the ones that I'm doing now where they have no connection. There was going to be a connection between these two, but I thought, hey, that's pretty neat to try and do it in different genres as well, like having a monster movie, but Joe's monster movie happens to be like Predator, an action film. Mike's happens to be like Phantasm, straight up horror, and Chris's happens to be a drama, like like Breaking Dawn or something, But it's the same thing, It's the same the same storyline, but told in different genres. I don't know if any of that stuff kind of works. I mean, I've never seen anybody do something like that, but I think creatively it would be neat to see it, to have something like that, and so that's where all of this is going,
So, what are your ambitions for your future work?
Well, this story right here, Paradise Cemetery, I want to make it into a chap book, which goes back to medieval times, when the printing press was first, created and stuff like that. And, these were cheap, little things that were thrown out there and, had, poor illustrations and whatever. They were called chap books. I'm sure you guys know about that. And so this, making it into a chap book, I think adds again to that whole feeling, that whole thing that I'm trying to go here with Paradise Cemetery, instead of releasing it as, let's say, a poetry book or something like that. Then there's a publisher here locally who is showing a lot of interest in wanting to do this chap book for me. So that's the where this is going to go. And like I said, the other stories, I'm finishing up Scary Mary because I want to submit it to the Austin Film Festival for next year. And then after that, there's another story called I'm a Weirdo, which I think will be not in a novelization somehow, whether it's short story or a straight up novel. That's the way I plan to do all these three things. So there you go.
Just to finish off, is there anywhere that people can go to learn for updates about this saga? And people want to know more. I certainly want to learn more. So where can people go to find out about that?
Well, since I'm just working on it right now, I'm trying to finish up as much as I can. But I definitely want to start creating my own web page and other social media sites that I'm going to start utilizing to push the story forward. The main thing really for me in the end isn't really even about I guess, for lack of better words, money or fame or anything like that. I think it's more about just getting the story out there and told, and having some kind of an audience. So as I finish things, like I told you guys, I'm pretty anal about that. So people always tell me, Chris, you take so long to write these things, and these things we love them, but you always take so long. I was a filmmaker at one time too. I had made a lot of these short films, and my short films would go out there and play in the film festivals, and people loved them. One of my films got a best of the fest at a underground film festival, but again, people tell me, you take so long, why do you take so long? But it's because I want the story to really be something. I don't want to just write something and people not respond to it. I really want to be able to touch the lives of individuals with stuff, and 30 years from today, have some kids say, "Oh yeah, I won this Oscar award for the story that I told. I remember there was this book that I read a long time ago by this guy, and that's what inspired me." I really want that. So I'm trying to finish up these stories, and then I'm gonna start creating this content where people could go and share their love or hate for the stuff that I do, and be able to again have that participation like you guys do. For example, having a YouTube channel, having Facebook, having your podcast. Your audience is able to connect with you, and love or hate you. All comments are welcome, and it's something like that for me as well. So I'll be sharing all that after a while. I'll be whether I have these pages going or not. My first comes first, and that's trying to finish up these 3 little stories, and then presenting the universe as a whole.
Absolutely. And it's, in the meantime, while you're getting these pages set up or whatever, you're absolutely free to post in our group and spread the word there. So
Oh yes, yeah, that's exactly right. I really do like that opportunity, and it's been given to me by a few other people as well. That are showing a lot of interest, but I'm not ready. Like people say, so are you looking for a publisher? I'm not ready for that yet, because in order for me to look for a publisher, first of all, I got to really have something concrete. Second of all, I got to make sure it's the right person. And to me, the most important thing is really just putting it out there. And so I'm not thinking on those lines yet. I'm thinking of finishing the work. Let me finish the work. Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road in I think it was like 7 weeks or something like that. He was on the road for 7 years. So it took him like 7 years to gather all of this stuff, and then he writes it and just throws it out there, and whoever bit, and became one of the quintessential reads of the latter 20th century. So I mean, I'm not saying that that's going to happen here. All I'm saying is that I'm a very patient man, and I really want to make sure that these things are done right.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about not worrying about success and fame and money and all that, and that's quite interesting, because it's something that Joe and I are working on a graphic novel together at the moment, and something we've sort of realized is that just write because you love it, and worry about all that stuff later. So it's great to hear someone else have
Mm-hmm. I remember, and that's one thing about my mind, the way my brain works, is that I can reference movie scenes and stories that I read, on the snap of a finger. So hearing that reminds me of the scene from the movie Field of Dreams, where the old man, Moonlight Graham, is given the opportunity to go and become a famous baseball player. He's an old man, and he's a doctor in this small town. And later on, when he saves the life of the little girl, he can't go back and turn himself young again. He's now stuck as the old doctor that he was. And Kevin Costner is apologizing to him, and the old man says, "But it's a tragedy, that you're never going to be in the big leagues." And the guy says, "The tragedy would have been if I never became a doctor and saved the lives of the people that I saved." So it's all a matter of perspectives. If you want to be a famous writer, try it and do what you got to do to do that. It's a lot of work, and if you're willing to put in the work, then go for it, man. All the more power to you. But if you're like me, if you were to ask me that question, well, Chris, you wrote these stories, and it's a tragedy. Well, I would say, well, the tragedy probably would have been in the fact that I would never work in a mortuary and be able to help the people there in doing that part of my life. My destiny took me in a certain direction, but I write because it's what I like doing. Charles Bukowski, the writer, would say, it's even on his on his gravestone, it says, "Don't try." What he meant was that if you're looking for approval of other people, if you're looking for fame and fortune, if you're all that stuff, then don't even try, because there's so many others that are doing that same thing. But if writing is what you want to do, it's where you want to be. You cannot think of your life without writing. That's when you try. That's when the best work is going to come. It's not going to come from the pressure of a publisher. It's not going to come from wanting to do the next big thing. It's going to come from your passion for doing it. And that's what I have. I just have this passion for writing, and I throw this stuff out there, and people are gonna like it. They're gonna hate it. It's gonna still, to me, is something that I will probably do till my dying breath.
I think that's a great note to wrap it up on. Christopher, thanks so much for telling us about your stories. We can't wait to see where they're headed next. But in the meantime, thanks so much again for speaking to us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for allowing this to happen. And I look forward to every other things that you guys are doing, and I'm very excited about that. So, the anthology. You said you were finished with that already?
Well, the competition,
the seasons.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because we're going to do a competition for each season, and that process is finished now. So next year we're going to start putting the anthology together, and that hopefully includes your story as well. So,
well, just keep me posted on that. That way, I could be able to add that to my little collection. Like I said, I just, it's just, these little things. But I mean, hey, my victories may be small, but they're plentiful.
Yeah. Well, don't worry. We definitely will keep you updated on that.
All right. Thank you so much.
So, yeah, thanks so much again, Christopher.
All right, Michael, Joe, y'all have a good one. Take it easy, and thank you again for this. Right, happy Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween.
Thanks for that, Christopher. Next up, we'll be having a poem by Ismael Rodriguez.
The Scar. Hey, what's that? Meg says, tracing a delicate finger down my neck. It's nothing. I self-consciously cover the twin scars with my collar. Looks like a cool scar. Car wreck, am I right? It's nothing. Forget it. I squirm in my seat behind the wheel. It's my first date with Meg. After a great time at a movie, she asks to park by the dam overview, and I nervously agree. I turn off the headlights and flash a look in the rearview mirror, then back at her. It's been a year, but I still can't forget the last time I was here. Meg, I had a great time, but maybe it's time to call it a night. My nervousness was evident in my voice. Come on, Paul, she says, circling her arms around my neck. We just got here. It's only 10 o'clock. Who ends a date at 10 o'clock? Seriously. I feel her lips on my neck. I see she's having fun. She's right. I should try to relax. It's a nice night, and the full moon is just coming up over the hills in the distance. Pretty romantic. I lean into her. The car jostles and I break our kiss with a start. Did you feel that? It's just the wind, Paulie. Relax. And get back in my arms, she smiles provocatively. I check the mirrors just in case. Nothing. I take in deep breaths to calm my heartbeat. Maybe it is the wind, I tell myself. We're on a hilltop. It's natural occurrence, wind. I go back to Meg, but keep one eye open, scanning the windows and the mirrors. As soon as things get interesting, a grey blur passes in my rear view. Shit, my voice cracks. I push away from her, breathing hard. I twist around, searching over my shoulders for it. What now? She says, throwing up her arms. I should have listened to Stacy. She said you were weird, no matter how cute you are. I don't register her complaints, and I search the darkness, trying to find what made the blur. My breath fogs up the windows. Nothing comes into view after a few minutes. I nervously rub my scar. I turn to Meg to tell her that we need to go, but she is staring into the side view mirror, shivering. Paul, she squeaks.
What happens next?
Come on, Ismail, you can't leave us hanging like that.
Anyway, here's our next story by Paul Bahu. The Shape in the Cloth. Daddy, there's something in my room. I'm scared. I rolled over to see my 5-year-old daughter, Chloe, standing by my bedside through bleary eyes. I glanced towards the clock. 3 a.m. on the dot. Another nightmare. Okay, honey, let me see what's up. I groaned as I sat up and wiped my hand down my face, pulling some collected crust from my eyes in the process. I slid out of bed and followed Chloe, who ran out of my room and into hers, her feet patting across the vinyl plank floor. I was only 5 seconds behind her, but by the time I entered her Little Mermaid-themed room, she had already climbed back into her bed and pulled the covers over her face, with nothing but a small tuft of hair peeking out from under the blankets. My knee popped as I sat down on her comforter and slid into a reclining position beside her. She occasionally had nightmares. A zombie in her closet, a monster under the bed, a giant robot peering through her second-story window. This had been a regular occurrence lately. Maybe it was the stress of starting kindergarten, or maybe just an overactive imagination. Then, as I lay there, looking about her assortment of dollhouses and stuffed animals, I saw it, the thing that frightened her. My eyes had to adjust just right, straining through a single nightlight's illumination, but there it was, unmistakably, standing silently behind a curtain. It was no bigger than Chloe, though its outlines were unmistakable. Head, torso, arms and legs gently wrapped in a thin piece of pink printed polyester. It didn't move, not so much as a breath. Even when the AC kicked on, it didn't so much as flutter. The curtains ended just right above the floor. Were those feet at the bottom? Perhaps it was just a trick of the light and shadow playing with my sleep-weary mind. No, impossible. There was clearly something standing there. Chloe had complained in the past about something that made her scared. But, like I told her, monsters weren't real. There was nothing in the closet, nothing under the bed, and no giant robots outside her window, waiting to snatch her up at the moment she fell asleep. But here, in her room, reclined atop a simple child's blanket, I see it, waiting. But for what? I run through my options. Do I ignore it? Hope it will just somehow go away? Do I comfort it? Maybe I'll jump out of the bed like a raving lunatic as I pull the curtain back, ready to strike with the fury of a dad in a fight or flight mode. But then I doubt myself. Is it really something? Is that outline a trick? Am I imagining it? Would satisfying my curiosity mean startling my daughter and most certainly scarring her for life? Therapy is expensive, all concern for safety aside. My daughter beneath the comforter turns, a nervous adjustment, subtle, only reminding me of what's at stake. I wonder if she knows I'm scared too, or maybe she's fallen back to sleep, dreaming about going on adventures with friends and Disney princesses, wholly disconnected from the creeping anxiety that holds me in place like gravity turned to 11. Is it real, the thing behind the curtain, the shape in the cloth, lying in wait? Hungry. For what? Flesh? Souls? Something else? Perhaps it's just there to taunt. A penance due for some old forgotten transgression. Maybe it's here for me. Maybe I just say something, just blurt it out of the room. I can protect my baby girl. There is nothing to be used for a weapon, just plushed animals, books and toys. Maybe the lamp? Would it even hurt? It was only maybe $20 at Target. Nothing that costs $20 could do any real damage, right? My poor girl, all this time trying to communicate with me, telling me something was in her room. It didn't have to be a zombie or a robot or whatever awful thing she was exposed to on her iPad over the last week when I wasn't looking. It's just how her little brain processed it. She may have liked the language to describe what is currently standing silently behind the curtain as my brain runs in circles. It could be awful. A demon or decayed spirit, almond-eyed and waiting to abduct me or Chloe. It could be one of those black-eyed children my wife talked about from that podcast of hers. Maybe we're just being robbed by someone of very short stature and they're just waiting for me to go back to bed. I want to act, but I'm frozen in place, neurons disconnected, or maybe it's just fear. I always thought I was brave, the type to run into a building or comfort a man with a knife, but here I am, unable to even lift myself out of my child's bed to protect her. I want to throw up, my stomach is pissed. Maybe it's scared, maybe it's just disappointed in me. My job is to protect her, to be the protector. What am I doing? Protect her, protect her, protect her, now! In one motion, I grab my phone, flip on the flashlight, leap to my feet and draw the curtain, pointing the light at the mysterious visitor. It was Chloe, tears streaming down her face. A wave of relief floods over my body, only to be shortly replaced by a new wave of dread. If she's the one behind the curtain, then that means... I looked at Chloe, her voice shook as she pointed over my shoulder. The small hairs on my neck raised as I could hear Chloe's comforter shift. As bed springs silently squeaked, a wet, choke wheeze hissed behind me. Daddy, it's behind you.
Lastly, we've got a story by Michael's brother, Chris Newton.
I'm Chris Newton. I'm the author of The Filed Witch, a tale of 17th century witchcraft in Lancashire, which you can buy from the Rogue Animal ebook store. But before that story was a novel, it began life as a poem called The Witch of Woodplumpton, which I'm going to read for you now. Deep beneath a boulder lay a filed witch called Marjorie, who ran in fields in guise of hare to feast upon the harvest. Her stolen pail she enchanted to waddle as a goose, and walk beside her up the lane, that none might know the truth. The farmer paid no heed as milk trickled from its bill. Meg took it home to Cuckoo Hall, and there she drank her fill. But the farmer was a wily fox who caught her in his barn one night. He counted 6 great sacks of grain, where once there had been 5. He took his pitchfork, gave a poke, the witch she was revealed, and walked thereafter with a limp, her fork wound never healed. But the farmer's fate was worse, much worse. That harvest was his last. His cows were dry, his crops all died, his chickens not one egg they laid. He died alone in poverty, and cursed the hag unto his grave. But mortal men have not the power to work their will with words, and there are things that foolish men oft fail to observe. There is magic in the changing season, magic in the earth. A cunning witch she walks betwixt the power of these worlds. So when the trees are ripe with fruit, and when the wheat grows tall, be mindful that you thank the witch that lives in Cuckoo Hall. And when you bring your harvest in, take heed and have a care. 'Tis wise to let the local witch take her rightful share. Happy Halloween.
Well, thanks to everyone who's joined us for this podcast. Thanks to Chris, thanks to Christopher, thanks to Paul and to Ismail for supplying us with these fantastic stories. That's it for this podcast, but Rambling Rogues is now back.
And happy Halloween, everyone. I hope you have a great night and watch some spooky films and read some spooky stories as well. Just have a good time.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.